Hello, everyone, and welcome back to a new episode of the Winning in Professional Services podcast. My name is Matteo. I'm joined today by my co-host, Scott. How are you?
I'm doing well, Matteo. Thanks so much for taking the time today.
Yeah, today we're having a good, interesting episode on productivity and planning for marketing and business leaders in general. We know that as marketing or business leaders, we are often, collaborate with other departments and people within the company. And obviously, with so much collaboration going on, we sometimes find ourselves scattered, a bit too thin across different projects and conversations happening simultaneously. But obviously, we need to try to value the time we have and try to find the time to focus on important projects that actually can move the needle and bring the company forward. And so, Scott, I'm interested in sort of your experience in finding time to work on, for uninterrupted period of time, sort of deep work, and how have you noticed any difference in sort of your productivity and output when you're able to focus on sort of longer periods of time working like this?
Yeah, well, I think one thing is work from home has probably both helped and hurt in certain ways when it comes to deep work, because if people, or at least not everyone, is always coming into the office. I've heard of some companies that maybe it's Fridays, they're not coming into the office, and maybe they have time more at home if they don't have kids or whatever else to focus on deep work. So I think that this work from home sort of influences some things. But to your question about the impact it can have, I think that so often we are distracted by things, whether it's constant meetings or it's reacting to emails or whatever else. And it is hard to get a lot of stuff done. And honestly, I reflect a little bit on this and think how much inefficiency there is. Now, I don't think we can 100% think of our life in terms of efficiency. I'm a father, and I could say I'm not as efficient because I have kids. But guess what? Efficiency is not everything in the world. So sometimes I do think about the fact that we are sometimes not the most efficient individuals, and we have to track and focus on how to improve in some of those areas. And you don't really know until you do track and you do reflect on this a little bit and try to strike the right balance. So my point is, we don't have to over optimize and be robots, but we can make some modifications to how we work to get more done. And guess what? As a business, we do need to get more done. So as business leaders, we have to get more done. So that's kind of my take on it. But Matteo, why is this an interesting topic for you?
I mean, it's an interesting topic because I have personally been suffering a little bit from being very distracted at work for many years, maybe because of the positions that I held in the past. Now, being a solopreneur is maybe a little bit different for me, but when I was managing teams and having to communicate and talk to people on a daily basis, whether that was through actual face-to-face meetings or even Slack communications, I would often find myself spending a good part of my days having conversations rather than actually doing work that was necessary also in my role as a leader or team leader, just because obviously I wasn't just delegating work to everyone. I needed to do some work myself as well. And so that's why I really think being able to understand how we optimize our days in, like you said, not as robots, but mostly just making sure that we're really allocating our time to activities that are most important to the sort of achieving the goals of the company is so important, in my opinion, especially like you said, nowadays. Being a remote worker could be a blessing at times, but could be sometimes a little bit of a curse, depending on how you see it. I think that just not being around other people could lead to more distractions at times, or it could even just lead to just much more deep work sessions. It all depends on the person that we're looking at. But again, I think it's important, and I think it would be interesting for us to discuss how we are approaching this type of deep work sessions ourselves. I know that there are different types of, and we talk about deep work or important work sessions. Again, deep work is a term that has been sort of brought up by an author, Cal Newport, a few years back. But again, I think it's highly relevant. And as marketing leaders, I would say there are different types of tasks that we could consider deep work. I think it's easier to identify the tasks that are not considered deep work in my mind. Like you said before, maybe it's email communications, Slack communications, or anything that is really not conducive of longer term sort of goals for the company. But do you have any thoughts about this type of sort of this differentiation between deep work sessions or shallow, quote unquote, work?
Yeah, I suppose we have to do both to some extent, but something that came to mind when you were sharing all that, Matteo, was I was thinking about being purposeful, right? So it's not necessarily about optimizing 100%, but it's about knowing where your time is going and making sure it's aligning with your goals. So an easy way to look at this is in finance. To some people, spending a few $100s a month on coffee might actually be money well spent. Maybe they most enjoy the time that they're spending or the money they're spending on that coffee because they love coffee and that's their thing, in which case that's completely fine. However, individuals that don't really care that much about coffee, if they're spending a couple $100s in coffee a month, then that's not time well spent, or money well spent. And so with finance, it's all about, track where your money's going and make sure that that is in aligning with your goals. And I think that brings us to this focus here, Matteo, is that it's not necessarily that we shouldn't ever be doing any of those small tasks. It doesn't mean we should never respond to an email. But if we're spending 90% of our day responding to an email and 10% of the day doing maybe the important things as a leader you should be doing, then there's a problem. And maybe that's our focus today, is really just making sure we're optimizing for what actually has the highest impact.
100%. And do you have any particular ways that you use to increase the time spent on this type of sort of impactful work?
Yeah, so the ways I think it's to be proactive and not reactive. I think that's really something that overlays all the stuff that we talk about. So I can jump into specific tools. Maybe I will just bring one example up, is I don't believe we should be reactionary to email. And so there are some times where there's a client email, there's emergency email, there's other things going on, and you have to respond to emails. However, if you are waking up in the morning and saying, let me respond to everyone's email, I'm not the first one to talk about this subject, but that's starting you out in a reactionary mode. And so since I read a book about this or whatever it was, I stopped starting my days by reading emails. Because just think about it. You're waking up, and then the first thing that you're doing is saying, how can I react to other people? Let me look through and see how I'm going to react to other people. And so that's not starting off on a positive note of let me plan my day accordingly, let me make sure that I'm focused on the most important things. You're essentially replying to the person who's at the top of your inbox. Mm-hmm. And that is not a good way to start a day. And so that's why email, to me, I have certain tools that I use to reduce my distractions to email. There's also just optimizations in how I start my day. Again, the first thing I do is not turn on my phone. I don't have my phone next to my nightstand. I do some things to optimize for this, but I think the key being I try to make sure that I'm not reacting to others. What about for you, Matteo?
Yeah, I like the idea of not starting with emails. I think it's easier also to just start with on the wrong foot. If you open the wrong email early in the morning, you could open a very nice email, but you could also find probably a negative one, and that would probably affect the rest of your day. So yeah, I think starting without emails is a good idea. Again, I think personally I like to plan my days in advance. I like to have a structure already pre-planned for my entire week. Generally, what I like to do is spend maybe a half an hour on a Sunday afternoon or my first half an hour or hour of a Monday morning, just planning out my week. And what that really means for me is making sure that I know what my priorities for the week are. And generally, that means having at least 2 or 3 big projects that I want to tackle over the course of the next 5 days, and then try to break those down into smaller chunks or smaller tasks, and then plug them all into my calendar as much as possible. I try not to be too OCD about it. Again, I've seen screenshots of Google calendars online of people having them all color coded, and it just looks like a Lego puzzle in a way. But the goal for me there is more about making sure that I know when to do certain types of tasks and work on certain type of tasks based on the deadlines of those projects that I'm working on, but also allowing a little bit of leeway for communication with other people if that happens or needs to happen, or even just small projects that come up without me really thinking about it in advance. So I try to give a little bit of, or leave a little bit of flexibility within my calendar, but as much as possible, I try to pre-plan everything in advance. Again, I know there is probably a bit of difference when you are just working a lot on your own, like I am these days, compared to when you are probably managing a team of people and working in a bigger organization where more people are maybe dependent on you also. You can't just say, okay, I'm working on these projects for the next 4 hours and nobody can talk to me, because that becomes a little bit tricky if there are dependency that you are sort of responsible of. But yeah, I don't know, maybe you have a little bit more insights on that since you are managing a team and you have this sort of view of what it means to work inside of an organization with more people that are probably also reporting to you.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't think I'm quite as optimized as you are, which is actually where I think today I'm going to learn a lot from you, Matteo, because I'm not as optimized. And in fact, I have been in the past. That there was a time where I was using a particular planner and I was able to organize stuff better. I guess I've fallen off the wagon a little bit, so I actually am using this as a good opportunity to ground myself a little bit and get back into that productivity mode that I think you've done such a good job getting into. To your question about managing other people, yeah, I'm not in a big organizational structure. I'm oftentimes coaching business owners or I'm coaching team members within their organization. And so a big part of what I do is coaching and guiding people, in which case I do have to be relatively accessible to them. They need to know when I'm available so I can have these regular meetings with them. But for the most part, what I'm doing is I'm guiding those individuals how to get stuff done more effectively or how to overcome the biggest challenging points that they have. And so as someone in a coach, I think it's a little bit less deep work time for me. It's a little bit like less of let me work on this certain project. And it's a little bit more of me preparing for these coaching sessions, but then also really focusing on the personal side of things during that time. So again, a little less optimized for productivity, I suppose. However, I want to point out something that you said, Matteo, is that you said that maybe for the week you have those 2 or 3 big projects. And of course, everyone does, right? So I do have some of those big projects. Maybe it's a podcast I have to edit. Maybe it's something else that I have to do. And I like that you said if you have those 3 things that you're going to focus on and then you broke them apart, you broke them down into pieces, and then you know what you have to get done, and you at least then have a loose idea of what you need to get done that week. And I think that's so important because I think something that people often fall into the trap of is they focus on the thing that is a little bit easiest to tick the box to. And so if that means it's responding to an email, then that means, oh, I'm going to get that. I'm going to feel relatively good because I've now ticked the box if I replied to that email. Mm-hmm. Or I've looked at some spreadsheet and done something I need to do for the spreadsheet. But what about the bigger projects? What about the things where it's going to take 20 hours to get something done? Well, you need to start chipping away at those things, in which case you need to plan out and say, I'm going to get this 20-hour project done, and the first 5 hours are going to get done this week. And I'm going to find time in my day to do that. And guess what? Now you're biting off pieces, and in 4 weeks, it'll get done. Whereas if you instead are not doing what you just described, it's easy to have that bigger project, something that's hanging over your head for a year, like literally a year. It could be if you're not starting to bite off those pieces. So I love what you just said there, Matteo, in terms of making sure that you're optimizing for the week and you're working on those projects and you're making progress one bite at a time.
Yeah. And again, I think for me, it's been, and I'm still learning on how to get better at this, especially when I was working at a company before. As a team leader, I had several big projects to take care of. And usually those big projects were decided at the beginning of each quarter. And when you're planning out the quarter activities, you're also already sort of trying to do that mental work of seeing of how long each one of these projects is going to be taking me to complete. And sometimes your calculations are not going to be super accurate. You're going to be overly optimistic on, how fast you can actually move forward with a project. But then when you actually start working on some certain things, you realize that actually you may have, oversold your capacity, or sort of tried to, thought that you could do this in 20 hours rather than maybe it's really going to take 40 or 50 hours to complete. And so it could be that sometime a quarterly plan needs to get revised midway, just because you're not really, going to be able to complete everything by the end of the quarter, just by the simple fact that you haven't really been able to estimate, the duration of certain projects. And I think that's okay. I think that's fine to readjust a quarterly plan as you go, just because it's, again, unless you really feel like you want to work 16 hours every day until the end of the quarter to, finish up everything, that probably is another option. But if you want to keep sanity, maybe you need to be able to adjust or readjust certain things.
Yeah, absolutely, Matteo. Life happens, and to your point, have a vision or a goal for that next quarter, then have it by, let's say, the month. What are you going to accomplish the month? Have it by the week, and each step, you're going to be making some modifications. Some things are going to get cut. Some of the fat's going to get cut off. We're actually not going to get that nice to have thing completed. However, hopefully your big goal, your big quarterly goal, is getting accomplished one way or another. It's just a matter of that it's not exactly the way you thought it would be, because who can actually plan 90 days in advance and be 100% on track exactly in every way? Mm-hmm. It's all about prioritization, in my opinion, and knowing what's going to have the highest impact.
One question for you, Scott, because this was something I was always trying, and I'm still trying to this day, to sort of solve within my, my business. Again, I do have several big projects going on, and sometimes there are projects that, or even before in the past, in previous companies, there were projects that were independent from each other, but equally potentially important. And I'm curious to know, what would be your way to prioritize a project? Meaning, would you rather spend an entire week working on a single project until it's done and then start the next one? Or would you spend, say, half of your week on one project and half of your week on another project? And so you would eventually finish up the two projects at the same time, say on week 2. But again, by splitting up your time on those two projects, for example.
Yeah, that's a really hard question, Matteo. I would come at it at a different angle, and you might not like this, but I would think of those projects in terms of who is able to do them. So I'm going to take the angle of delegation, which isn't always something you can do as a solopreneur or something, but I'm just saying that it's the question not of who's the best at doing the thing or who can do the thing. It's more about what is the thing that only this person can do or only you can do, right? And so if you're thinking, I've got 3 projects going on, it's hard to know which one to focus on, and it's kind of like, okay, well, this one Sally can do. She's about half the speed of this particular subject, and Jimmy can do this one. He's about a quarter of the speed of what I can do, but only I can do this one. Okay, so in that case, I would really be focused on doing the one that only I can do. And so I don't know, this is just a concept where I think, especially as leaders, especially as owners, it's easy to fall into the category of, I'm really good at this thing. I'm way faster than these 2 other people at doing this thing. But I think delegation is the big unlock, because it's then to say, it doesn't matter if I'm 3 times as good at doing something. Mm-hmm. It only matters what other people are unable to do that only I can do. And I can't leave those things by the wayside. Let's say it's the vision document. Let's say it's the quarterly plan. Let's say it's something else. Whatever that is, if it's the thing that only you can do, focus on that. Now, I guess I'll try to answer it more directly. I mean, your question of should you focus on getting the project done that you can, like, should you get one done and then move on to the next? Should you separate them? I still think that so much of that does depend on your way of working. So, Matteo, you might have a way that you handle this, but let's say that you need some variation in your work. Maybe you're not good at doing deep work on one particular thing for a whole week, and then you continue it for the whole next week. And like, maybe you're going to get into your zone where you're going to be not as creative and you're not going to be able to do that. So in that case, maybe it is taking 3 steps forward with one project, pausing, going to another project, taking 3 steps forward on that project, and coming back to it. So I think part of it comes down to your own working style and what is going to be optimized for the way that your brain works, right? But have you found a way that's worked well for you, or is there a consistent method?
No, I haven't really. I've tried both ways. I've tried to just work work on a single project until that was done and then move on to the next one. I would say that's probably the most mentally taxing way of working potentially, because you are extremely focused on just one thing, and that one thing only continues day after day until you're really done. The downside to me, especially the feeling I had at those times, was that after finishing that one project, it almost felt like too much time was passed until I could actually work on something else. So I do like the idea of managing a couple of different things at sort of in parallel, just because it feels like more things are moving forward at the same time rather than just one thing. Maybe the ultimate sort of outcome doesn't really change much, but just from a self satisfaction standpoint, probably I like the idea of splitting up projects a little bit more. Maybe I just want to switch topic a little bit and make it a little bit maybe more relevant to our audience that are maybe less solopreneurs and mostly business leaders or marketing leaders, head of teams. And I think as marketing leaders or business leaders in general, we do have one category of tasks that probably takes up a lot of our time just because of the nature of our role. And I think that category of tasks are meetings. I remember having tons of meetings in my previous companies, different companies before. And as much as I tried to streamline my meeting schedule, I could never really do it effectively. I would always end up with, meetings pretty much every day of the week, splitting up my day in half and sort of not allowing me to really have any, even if I just wanted to have 1 or 2 hours of deep work, those were not even possible. What would you recommend to business leaders that have this quote unquote issue of having a lot of meetings on a daily basis or having a lot of reports? What would you say to those people? How to sort of help them?
Wow. So it's a great one. I think we all have that issue of meetings. I think one tip that I have here would be to assess the purpose of every meeting and go through a process of clearing your calendar and reassessing whether or not it's worth it. I've heard before this could be used in terms of the governments or whatever. If you have your budget all taken care of, as a government, the default shouldn't be that everything continues on the following year. You should actually kind of start the next year and say, does this still make sense to do? Otherwise, everything piles on top of each other, right? Mm-hmm. And so same with, maybe government initiatives or whatever else. If you end up with 50 new initiatives every year, you're going to end up with thousands and thousands of initiatives after a few years. So I think it's the same thing. Click the reset button. Click the reset button and say, is there a purpose to this meeting? Is it valuable to us? Does it make sense? And so that's one thing. Another thing would be to potentially set either your morning hours or your evening or your afternoon hours as the time that you're most typically available for meetings. So I've heard some people say that they only take afternoon meetings and the morning is for them. I'm a little bit more of I like to get my meetings out of the way in the morning. So I'm more of I set my calendar so that there's plenty of availability throughout the week. I don't block off my whole calendar so no one can possibly book a meeting with me, but I tend to have my meetings in the morning. And so that I think is another thing to do. And this goes back to your point before, Matteo, of if we over-optimize for ourselves, we could be really making everyone else's life, like our subordinates, very difficult. And I think we have to strike a balance there. And that's where I'm saying, I don't say, you can only meet with me Wednesday between the hours of 1 and 2 p.m., right? That would not be fair to anyone else. But if I say, you know what, I will allow for morning meetings between the hours of from 7 a.m. to 10:30 a.m. every day of the week, that's my, quote, unproductive time, I guess you could say, but it's the time where I'm helping empower other people, then I think that's a decent compromise. So those are just two tips that I have. What about you, Matteo?
I think it's a good idea to, just not block out your entire week, obviously, especially when you have people that are at some point in time need to have, conversations with you. My strategy was, back when I worked at a company with more people reporting to me, was to try as much as possible to plan out my meetings with enough notice. I would say 1 or 2 weeks in advance, just so that I knew already before. And in the role I was in, that was possible. I was leading the marketing team, and I knew already when the monthly marketing strategy meeting was, when my one-on-ones were, and everything else was already pre-planned. Every meeting was already recurring, so that was fairly predictable. But of course, there are times where an ad hoc meeting needs to be scheduled, and maybe there is an urgent campaign that needs to be planned or discussed, and you need to have those impromptu conversations a bit more often. Again, I was not a huge fan of those, but I was still able to accommodate them whenever those needed to happen. Although, again, I was, as much as possible, trying not to have those. And like you said, I like the idea of optimizing not just for yourself, but also for the team that you work with. Although I don't know, maybe you disagree with me, but I think as a business leader, maybe you at times need to be a bit more of a little dictator. Again, not in a bad way, but I think I like the idea of letting other people know in advance what my work style is, and just let them know that I would prefer not to schedule a meeting within a day. If at all possible, a meeting should be at least, 2 days out or 3 days out, just so that I can plan myself and I can plan my schedule around that meeting. But I also understand that given the leadership position I was holding, I was also required sometimes for this more important meetings that needed to happen with less notice than what I wanted to have at times. But I don't know if you agree with that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the way you put it is just making people aware of your preferences.
Yeah.
And so long as your preferences aren't so narrow that everyone has to bend backwards for you, right? And I think a couple days notice before meetings, things like this, these are all reasonable. Maybe I like morning meetings, or anytime you can schedule them with them in the morning of Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday. I really don't prefer Friday, but I'm open to it if it came down to it, right? If you're just expressing that to everyone that plans meetings with you, then chances are you're not going to have those Friday meetings, and in only a case of emergency. So that's, I think, really important. One last thing that comes to mind with meetings, though, is I said before, clear meetings that are recurring that aren't valuable. There are some meetings that everyone's going to be sighing, thinking, oh, I got to go into XYZ meeting because we always have that meeting every week, and just the meeting that we have. I think as much as possible, you don't you kind of survey team members on that and make sure we're cutting out those meetings. If 4 out of 5 people hate the meeting, there's a problem. Let's address that. Let's remove it. I actually don't. Some people go the other way, and they say we shouldn't have recurring meetings because then that's naturally to happen. Eventually, the meetings can become less useful. I'm kind of not in agreement with that, mainly because I do see the value of recurring meetings where you always know and you can always block off your time and you always know that that's dedicated to this purpose. Whereas if you get rid of that recurring meeting, then I think that they can make their way into more ad hoc meetings all the time, which I think it throws more of a curveball. So, but sorry, one last point on meetings is you and I have talked a lot more about the agile way and thinking a little bit more like how development teams can operate under agile. And I think to me, it's so important to have the one core meeting with every team that I lead, which is the kind of weekly planning meeting of the sprint. And to say, what are we doing this week? What is the focus of this week? What are the most important things? What are we going to prioritize? What do we all agree upon? And getting that prioritization and the planning and the delegation and everything going, that one core weekly meeting will allow for less ad hoc meetings, in my opinion. And that's the one non-negotiable. It's like our weekly sprint planning is a meeting that's always going to happen because it's core to what we do. And ideally, that's the only meeting with that team, other than maybe one-on-ones.
Yes.
So that's one way that I like to optimize meetings. There's not just a meeting on a quote, a subject. Instead, it's a meeting on prioritizing the items for the week. And then that should be pretty much all inclusive, all the things we need to do for that week.
I agree. And again, another thing that we discussed before we hit record was the idea that the higher you are in the hierarchy of the organization, the less probably you're going to have time for actual long sessions of uninterrupted work, deep work sessions like we talked about them in the beginning, but rather you're going to be able to more enable and allow your subordinates, your managers or directors, to actually get to have those deep work, important work sessions throughout the week by delegating to them and by allowing them to delegate to their own subordinates at the same time. So again, I think we shouldn't necessarily think of having all this sort of deep work sessions throughout the week necessarily, depending on the nature of our role within the company. I think as business owners or even directors, sometimes we have to interface ourselves and communicate with so many people that it can sometimes be impossible to really have this sort of long sessions of deep work. And what really is the idea is that how can you actually enable people within your teams to have those deep work sessions instead of you having them, and maybe even preventing them to be able to communicate to you or with you at important times whenever your input is needed, because you have for some reason decided I'm unavailable, I have a deep work session ongoing. Any thoughts on this?
Well, yeah, actually, I want to segue into something related, Matteo, is that what it comes down to, again, is not necessarily saying let's, as leaders, optimize for deep work, as you just said, but it is being purposeful with your time. And so I'm curious, when it comes to assessing where is our time actually going, are we actually prioritizing appropriately? Are there any tools or anything that you've ever used to help assess where your time is going, just to make sure that you are focused on the right things?
Yes. I used a couple tools in the past. One is Rescue Time, and another one is Toggle. They both have a browser extension, Chrome extension, probably even other browsers extensions. And the way they work, essentially, it's either you manually track every task you are doing within the application, or some of them even have automatic detection of whatever window is open on your laptop, and they would essentially just track everything you're doing on your laptop. And at the end of the week, at the end of the day, it would give you a summary of all your tasks, of where you have spent the most time during that week or day. I think those are extremely valuable and useful, because especially when you are maybe understaffed as a company, sometimes as a leader you try to help out in different areas of the business, and that could result in you not actually working on tasks and projects that are mostly in line with your role, but rather trying to cover holes where necessary. And I think that's okay for short periods of time, but it shouldn't become the norm, especially for a CEO or a managing director or a marketing director or any other type of leadership role within an organization. And so maybe sometimes just reassessing where you're spending your time is valuable. It allows you to really find out whether maybe more personnel is needed in certain areas of the business, and you, without really knowing, have incorporated into your daily or weekly routine certain tasks that maybe should be handed over to other people within the company. So yeah, I would maybe recommend one of these two tools, Rescue Time and Toggle. I think Toggle is free. I think both have free and paid versions, but I think the free version is more than enough for most people.
Yeah, I've used those tools before, and I think there is a hurdle to get over, because I think sometimes when we think of time tracking, we might think of like clocking in and clocking out in a retail job, or we might be thinking about maybe we have some team members do tracking to track how quickly a ticket gets resolved or whatever it may be, right? And there's a feeling of, well, me as an owner, me as a leader, I'm doing too many things. There's no way. But I think that the goal is not to say how can you, quote, optimize your time. And again, it's more of just understanding where your time is going so you can better prioritize it. And the uncomfortable truth, I think honestly some people avoid this step because they're a little bit scared of what the data will tell them. And chances are they might be spending 90% of their day in email. They might be, responding to HR questions constantly. And to your point, Matteo, maybe the reality there is, maybe we need a more senior HR leader of some sort so that I'm not spending 60% of my day dealing with HR issues, right? It's all about getting data. It's all about being able to make better decisions. And so I think that we need to see a little bit of that data, even if it makes us uncomfortable at first. So I like the idea of using some of these tools. I've definitely used both of those tools at one point. I admit it's been a few years since I've used them, but I definitely got my reality checks a couple years ago when I first saw it, and it's probably time that I give it another try and get my reality check again. So it's
Yeah.
great tips there.
Yeah, I think generally just being self-aware of, how you're spending your time. Maybe you're not actively thinking about tracking time today. Maybe after listening to this, maybe a bell is going to ring. But I think just being always a little bit aware of how you're spending your time on a daily basis. It might seem like you're doing productive work, but sometimes it's just good to have something that is a bit more objective to tell us whether we are actually working on productive tasks and important tasks rather than just things that make us look like we are doing it, but we are really not.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Absolutely. One question I have for you, Matteo, you had mentioned how you plan your week in advance and how you, again, make sure that you're focusing on the core tasks. Do you have any tips or tools or processes that you follow that you can share with how you go about planning your week?
How I go about planning my week. To me, the simplest tool I use is my Google Calendar, and I simply just drag it and add tasks on the calendar. I do use Notion for a lot of my project management with clients and personal projects, but I do migrate every task. Every project is broken down into tasks, and then every task is into my Google Calendar. And I do have all of my tasks inside of Google Calendar. And like I said before, I just pre-plan everything in advance as much as possible. What I actually learned was that before I was trying to be very strict with my schedule to a point where I wouldn't leave much of a gap between one task and another task. So say I would plan 2 2-hour sessions in an afternoon, and I wouldn't leave any gaps between these 2-hour sessions. So as soon as I would finish session 1, I would jump straight into session 2. And I found that was actually not possible or feasible to sustain. First of all, because sometimes a task doesn't actually end at the clock of the hour, so at the second hour, at the end of the hour. So sometimes I would end later, or sometimes I would end it earlier. And secondly, it's just that I needed time to maybe take a walk or take a quick break to make sure I would come back to start my second sort of session with a fresh mind and a little bit more energy than just jumping straight into it. So again, those are things that I have learned over time. Now that I talk about it, obviously it seems very obvious, Matteo, why would you stack 2 2-hour sessions one after the other? Again, I am kind of a perfectionist and try to optimize every single hour of my day as much as possible. I try not to eat in front of my laptop, but it happens sometimes, and I know it's not healthy. So again, there are things that I try to constantly optimize myself on how to feel always energized and always as much as possible with a clear mind, so that I can work and have good ideas and make sure I don't go down different or wrong paths as I start having these long deep work sessions.
Yeah, I'll share a couple of things that I do for planning my day or my week. So one of them is journaling at the end of the day, because I've kind of heard this concept of if you're decompressing and if you're sharing the things that went well, didn't go well at the end of the day, and potentially what you plan on doing the following day in that evening, then potentially your creativity juices can flow when you're sleeping and you're thinking about the next day overnight, basically. So journaling, getting everything down on paper, planning for the next day, and then going to sleep. And then, of course, at the start of the next day, not starting with a reactionary mode. So for me, I won't go too deeply into this, but I wake up and the first thing I do is something difficult, right? Which plays into something I'll say in a second. But I take an ice bath in the morning. So it's kind of take a shower, then take an ice bath, then go for a walk. And that's a way that I do listen to things. And ideally, I wouldn't, when I go for my walks in the morning, I would just, clear my head a little bit and plan for the day a little bit more. But in any case, sometimes I do listen to podcasts and stuff. So I'll do that walk. And then now I can sit at my desk and start focusing on that most important task. So that way I've got my sunlight. I've done a hard thing already, which is the ice bath. And now it's time to settle and get some stuff done. And so this plays into another tip that I have, which is eat that frog. So there's a book called Eat That Frog, which is do the most difficult thing. I mean, there's plenty of ideas in the book about productivity and whatnot, but one of the concepts that stuck with me that I still remember many years later is eat the frog. If you don't want to eat the frog, then you're going to avoid eating the frog, and it's never going to get eaten. Right? That's not the way the author put it, but the point is do that most difficult task first. And so if that's an annoying task you have to do, if that's an appointment you have to book, if it's something that you just really don't want to do, that is the thing you should be focused on, as opposed to that nice little endorphin rush that you get from answering that simple task and answering that one email. You're going to feel good about that, but it's actually not the hardest, most important thing to do. So do the most important thing first in the day. And again, you can do that a little bit after you've gone for a walk, after you've decompressed, if you've done these things. Now it's take it on. It's time to take it on, take on the day. So those are my main tips. But did you have any other kind of tips for the listeners?
No, no more tips. Actually, one question for you, Scott. I like the eat the frog concept. Would you say an eat the frog type of task is always the longest task, or doesn't necessarily have to be?
No, I think it's just the one that you're going to avoid, right? Because realistically, if you say, I can answer this email, I can do this project, let's say that you just like video editing and you're not head of video editing, but you just that's your comfort zone. Chances are you're going to start doing, I'll just do that video editing, or I'll just, revise some transcript or whatever it may be. And that's the area that you're most comfortable. And I think the goal here is it's not how long it is and technically how difficult it is, it's how likely you are to want to avoid it. So essentially the thing that you want to avoid, don't avoid it, take that thing on first. So that's the frog in your life. So make sure you eat it.
Nice. No more tips from me. I think we've covered a lot of ground today in this episode. We talked about, what did we talk about? Well, the benefits of deep work sessions and distraction-free work, and how leaders can actually enable their teams to have this type of deep work sessions. We talked about a few tips and tricks on how to schedule and plan out our weeks, and then again, just be mindful of the type of meetings that each one of us gets into, and how we plan out our weeks, and how we structure our projects, big projects, into smaller chunks. All of these are highly valuable tips everyone should pretty much follow to have a sort of sane work relationship with work, I would say. So thank you so much, all of you, for tuning in today, and feel free to leave a review or even send us questions that you want us to answer in future episodes. Until next time, thank you so much for tuning in. Bye.